Hello viewers, I'm Jalanita Swai. Our guest today is Dr. Dereje Feyissa. He is a prominent Ethiopian scholar and associate professor at Adwa University, renowned for his work in social and political anthropology, migration studies, and conflict resolution in the Horn of Africa. He holds a doctorate in social anthropology from Martin-Luther University in Halle, Germany, and has enriched his academic career through research fellowships at prestigious institutions including Osaka University, the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, and as a Humboldt Fellow at the University of Beirut. His research, which spans topics such as ethnicity and conflict, borders and transnationalism, as well as the nexus between religion, development, and women's rights, has significantly influenced both academic discourse and policy frameworks in the region. Stay tuned. Dr. Dereje Feyissa, welcome to our strategic podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Let's move to the first question. What are grand narratives in your perspective, and why are they essential in the modern nation-building process?
For me, my understanding of grand narratives is they are structured stories, and there is a discourse behind them. And these are not just ordinary stories, but the stories that nations tell themselves. Because one way or the other, all nations are narrated in a certain way. And this has a lot to do with also a country's national role conception, how it positions itself vis-a-vis the region or internationally, has a lot to do with, what is the major thrust in its self-understanding. And this brings us to the issue of stories. And different nations are narrated differently.
Great. My second question is focusing on Ethiopia. So the current pillars of grand narratives are the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dome and also patriotism. So what other grand narratives can you share with us, and also how have been they utilized so far?
I think before we zoom into current narrative practices, I would like to bring in a bit of a historical perspective, because current narratives build on previous narratives or their reaction to pre-existing narratives. For a very long period of time, I think Ethiopia Ethiopian nation or the Ethiopian state was narrated in the form of sacred narratives. Yeah? Ethiopian exceptionalism has a lot to do with this kind of covenantal relationship between Ethiopia and God, as it is claimed to have been mentioned in the scripture. The reason why many Ethiopians feel they are different and exceptional, that we are not country X, country Y, but there's a certain historical intimacy between Ethiopia and the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the idea of the Ethiopia island of Christianity is not just simply an ordinary story that just surfaced by chance, but there is a long history towards that, and this self-understanding is very important, for Ethiopian to the kind of idea that they have acquired about themselves has a lot to do with this kind of sacred narratives. This Ethiopia's, different. The story of Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, it might, from a very secular point of view, might dismiss and forget who takes this seriously. But this is a myth. This is a narrative which made history. And for a long period of time, this Solomonic narrative, if you will, has been part of the Ethiopian national psyche, and which has substantially defined Ethiopia's sense of exceptionalism. And this has played out both domestically and in the region, why there is this issue of Ethiopia, an island of Christianity, and it relates to this story, as I said, but also it generated very exclusive narratives domestically. Hence, up until recently, we used to say Muslims in Ethiopia, as if Muslims cannot be Ethiopian. It's a contradiction in terms. It's a Christian nation. They could be hosts, they are refugees, but it ends there. And that was the case more or less until the 1974 revolution. But then, as part of social justice and rights issues, they negotiated that, or they expanded the boundaries of Ethiopian citizenship, And Ethiopia started going beyond myth or this kind of sacred narratives and searching for more inclusive narratives. But I'm also interested, for instance, to what extent this self-understanding, Ethiopia as an island of Christianity, has really shaped Ethiopia's foreign policy. So this is an island surrounded by a Muslim sea, which also includes our neighbors. So like, it's only recently that Ethiopia started re-engaging with the Arab world and the Muslim world more broadly. Arabs are, bad guys in town. They are there, to conspire and undermine Ethiopia's national interest. And this is the reason why they supported the Eritrean independence, or, everything goes wrong has something to do with the Arab world because, they want to attack a Christian nation, yeah? So, these are the kind of key narratives and structured stories which really affected Ethiopia's national role consumption. Since the revolution, we have been searching for more inclusive and less conflictual narratives. And then since 1991, and the new grand narrative became ethnicity, the master narrative that, it is ethnicity stupid, that's the most important thing, and then it became a structuring principle for our politics. And again, ethnic federalism is not just simply an Ethiopian story and an Ethiopian experience, but it has also implications on the region, yeah? And, just to give you an example, why the Eritrean government is so much threatened and why is there so much involved in Ethiopia's domestic politics, which is very evident. For instance, President Isaias, in his annual address, he always, one way or the other, makes a reference to the problem in Ethiopia is their constitution, ethnic federalism, as if it's kind of like he's part of this Ethiopian political community. The reason for that is this master narrative, now how Ethiopian state is restructured along ethnic lines, the direct implications on the region. Because given Ethiopia's geographic centrality, cross-border settlement pattern, what is Eritrea? Yeah? It's a nation of it's a country of 9 nations. Yeah? Of these 2 major ones, the Tigrinya speakers and the Afar, are also living in it. Not only they live in Ethiopia, but the larger chunk of this group of people live in Ethiopia. Just grant it a possibility of success, this model. So then, the Tigray region would evolve as a center of gravity for Tigrayan politics, and Afar region for Afar politics, and the Afar triangle, the base would be in Ethiopia. So they feel threatened. So this is how I see it, that kind of like, what is the story that we really use to tell our nations and the implication of that in our foreign policy. Coming to your question, since, post-2018, there are some continuities, but also really I would call it a rupture even in our stories. My key term to understand political dynamics and geopolitical dynamics in the region, and particularly in Ethiopia since 2018, is the concept of disruption, as it is used by the establishment as well. Disruption of the status quo, in terms of like to what extent ethnicity has been a master narrative, but then the need to balance this with the politics of national unity, ultimately, at least officially, to go towards a post-ethnic state within Ethiopia. And then also regionally, the status quo is found very oppressive, not favorable for Ethiopia's national interest. So both domestically and in the region, Ethiopia is really disrupting the status quo. It does that in many ways. Just to build on what I said, for instance, it started already since 1974, more so 1991, and it was accentuated post-2018. The narrative of Ethiopia as an island of Christianity is no longer tenable, no longer valid. Not only is deconstructed, but it is replaced by a different narrative. I don't know to what extent we have the time to delve into that, but for instance, I briefly mention now I call it the Najashi narrative. Is the counter-narrative to the Solomonic narrative, because Ethiopia has been considered as a very Christian nation, but now there is a different perspective which brings Ethiopia also very special in the history of Islam. There's a very strong Ethiopian component in early Islam. The first country where Muslims were present outside of Arabia was in Ethiopia, in Aksum. Yeah? And this story has been conveniently silenced for so long. But now this is being revived domestically for nation building purposes. Me as an Ethiopian Muslim, I would feel very comfortable to hear this story, that I can see myself in the Ethiopian story. So Ethiopia is also exceptional for Muslims, a land of righteousness, a land of justice, a first country where this asylum was applied for, if you will. I mean, there's a lot which you can unpack and use it for nation building, for inclusive citizenship. This is domestically. But the same, look what has happened, the same story is strategically deployed in order to enhance diplomatic relationship with the Arab world, particularly with the Gulf countries. Now, the Najashi story has been highlighted and pronounced, and sometimes the reason why you see kind of Muslim public holidays in Ethiopia being celebrated, the street iftar, even the Prime Minister told us, and also the Muslim leaders in UAE, for instance, many people find it very difficult, like, are there that many Muslims in Ethiopia? This is not the image. So they wanted to change that image, like not only that there are many Muslims in Ethiopia, but Ethiopia is very important in Islamic history. This has been used in order to forge strong diplomatic ties between Ethiopia and the Arab world, particularly the Gulf countries. So our stories are also evolving, and some of them are very important for nation building, but also in order to kind of forge strategic ties with our neighbors. But there's another new narrative which I briefly mentioned, and this is disruption, yeah? Ethiopia's big push in Red Sea politics, for instance, and to what extent this might bring in partly new forms of integration, but also it's fraught with tension and potential conflict. And again, the story that Ethiopia First is telling itself now, the new story that we haven't properly used our cards, geopolitical cards. We are the most numerous, so kind of like demographically the largest, the second most populous nation in the continent, and geographic centrality, the only country in the region which neighbors all countries except Uganda, and transboundary rivers, probably the only country in the world which is wholly upstream. Some countries are upstream for one river, but maybe downstream for the other. But Ethiopia is 100% upstream. Not a single river comes to Ethiopia, but all rivers leave the country, except Awash, which is a very nationalist river, by the way. It starts and ends in Ethiopia, but all the others. So this is the new story that Ethiopia is the Africa's kind of water tower, yeah, the Switzerland of Africa. And so like, let's make use of it, what is our comparative advantage? And we can leverage this in order to negotiate our position in the region. And also mobilizing the past, with, of course, is a selective memory. Yeah, like Ethiopia used to have access to the sea. So we are not claiming something new, but there are times when Ethiopia had a port or a coast. So I mean, these new stories, which I think are very realist, at the formative stage, this is kind of like very strong realist dose. It makes sense to some extent in order to negotiate, but also it might also bring in new ways of regional integration. As I said, perhaps allowing new thinking for strategic exchange of critical resources. For instance, it's true Ethiopia is blessed with many rivers, and nearly all of them happen to be transboundary. But also the neighboring countries have large coastline, yes? And as in Ethiopia, that we have more rivers than we can potentially make use of them, our neighbors also might not really exhaustively use all this long coastline. So, in a very pragmatic way, we can create this kind of more complementary regional economies, if it's a single story and then all the neighboring countries saying hands of Ethiopia from the Nile, hands of, from, Omo River or Wabi Shabele River, then what would remain for Ethiopia, yeah? But then it can also there could be trade-off between Ethiopia and in the regions, but this should be done in a more conflict-sensitive manner. Just a big push in national interest could be inherently conflictual. But let's hope that this is a formative stage. The disruption is in order to set an agenda, to initiate a new regional conversation. In that sense, yes, but where does this end? Because, as you pursue your national interest, you also provoke others also to intensify activities around national interest, and then the cumulative effect of this would be, making the region more conflictual than it is already.
Great. My third question is, unlike nationalism, patriotism is seen as constructive in the grand narratives of multicultural nations such as ours, Ethiopia. So how do you compare and contrast both of these big concepts and concerning the current nation-building process in Ethiopia?
I think patriotism is we haven't come that long. I think these are nationalist projects. Let's face it, not just in Ethiopia, but all countries in the region. It's very heightened nationalism, and nationalism oftentimes it requires an oppositional other, and the self is defined negatively vis-a-vis the other, and that's why at some point there should be an element of being post-nationalist, a bit more pragmatic, and kind of one which considers collective security, collective interest, and redefining interest at the regional level. But we haven't reached that level. You might hear governments, presenting their issues in the language of patriotism, but it's kind of very, very nationalistic with all its limitations.
Great. So many scholars and analysts consider Ethiopia to be going under a transitional period. So during where institutions are being rebuilt and new organizations are being organized. So how essential are grand narratives during such transitional periods, and also how are they relevant to Ethiopia's current transition?
Yeah, as I said, nations are partly the story that they tell about themselves. So what is the foundational myth, the foundational stories? And we start from the island of Christianity or sacred narratives. But we have also seen the limits of this kind of foundational myth. Now, since 1974, I think we have been searching for more integrative narratives. We have even reached a point where we started contesting something which we shouldn't have. My best example would be the Adwa story, which goes, strictly speaking, even beyond. It's not only an Ethiopian story. It's an anti-colonial, it's a justice project, and at least minimum, it's an African story. But what has happened recently? This beautiful story has been contested. There has been a scramble over Adwa. Who has contributed how much? Whose story is that within Ethiopia itself? But now I see there are some positive developments to kind of redefine Adwa also on a more integrative basis. And this also helps a lot for nation-building projects. We are at the very formative stage of kind of reconfiguring the Adwa story, hence it's also conflictual. But then you see some commendable measures to make it more inclusive, because it is truly, if Ethiopians do not agree on Adwa, what else? Yeah, it goes that far. So we really need to re-engage with the Adwa experience and story and tell it in a way that it's more integrative. I understand, for long it wasn't as inclusive as it should have been, but then the pushback or the counter-narrative could also be equally problematic if it's not really handled in a more conflict-sensitive manner. Where should we define the boundaries of inclusion? Who should be included, who not? Whose story should be highlighted, yeah? We just started that reconfiguration of the Adwa story. I see some very positive development, but I'm also concerned to what extent, while we are trying to redress the limitations of the previous way of we were telling the Adwa story, but are we also not becoming partial, or at what cost is our new grand narratives are coming? But, you know, let's take time and then see to what extent we really make improvement. But for me, as I said, re-engaging with the Adwa story is not only for nation building or for domestic purpose, but also it has a regional implication. This is also giving us a chance to re-engage, re-embrace our African roots, Ethiopia's Pan-Africanist role, which has been diminished, but recently, you know, it's being reviving. Last week I attended a conference called Pan-African Youth Summit. It's so interesting that the Adwa story is being retold, you know, as an African story. And there are youth from all over the continent, and they felt a sense of belonging that, you know, if Addis Ababa is also theirs, Ethiopia is also their home. Previously, we used to say, you know, Addis Ababa is the political capital of Africa, but what does it really mean? And to what extent, you know, we make it kind of like more comfortable for other Africans to come, and then, you know, this kind of place-making, belonging. And, you know, our grand narratives are very important. And for me, Adwa is our major grand narrative, which has huge potential for nation building, but also for regional integration, but also for Pan-Africanism.
Mm-hmm. Great. In your opinion, how successful has the Adwa inclusive story, not just the Adwa, but other grand narratives, has been successful, not just in Ethiopia, but as you just mentioned, in the sense of Pan-Africanism and also inclusivity of other African nations?
This is still unfolding. Like, you know, we're talking about, you know, a couple of years that we, you know, like we seriously started in re-engaging with grand narratives, and this project has been complicated because, you know, during the previous government, you know, grand narratives were really dismissed somehow. They were associated with imperial Ethiopia. And so it's kind of, the focus is mainly on kind of like making a new nation from scratch with a new master narrative with ethnicity. And, you know, the big chunk of that project was the politics of difference. So there was even no need of grand narrative. So we are busy in looking for what we don't agree on. And the differences, which is also important. We need to embrace diversity, divergences. Ethiopia needed its own pluralistic turn, but then you can't just build a nation through a politics of difference. Yeah, it's only towards, you know, the end that, you know, the previous government started re-engaging with grand narratives, and sometimes with kind of apparent contradictions. But these mega projects, for instance, started, you know, in the previous government, and that was considered as Ethiopia's new mysterious magnetism. So no longer the sacred narratives like a nation which conquered poverty, for instance, and a country which has achieved accelerated economic development, because you build nations, and the kind of grand narratives could also be around collective accomplishment, a pride in collective accomplishment. So it started, but it was too little and too late. And that has something to do with the political order, which was the edifice of which was mainly built around the politics of difference. But now that difference is being complemented by the politics of national unity, I would rather say, and that created a new space for reworking on our grand narratives, the search for common grounds and things which you also share as a nation or as a country. And I think, you know, it would be a bit too unfair to be kind of judgmental. Rather, I see the positive developments, but this is just work in progress. But we have to be very careful and cautious in picking and selecting, you know, which story, what constitutes grand narratives. I don't know if I have time, I can, for instance, as much as I'm fascinated about the reconfiguration of the Adwa story on a more inclusive basis. For instance, there is one grand narrative which is under construction, which makes me feel uncomfortable. I call it the Karamara narrative. This is a new grand narrative which has been, you know, pushed since 2018. This is as much integrative as it is conflictual. For some people, they really want to remember that period. Ethiopia prevailed over Somalia against the Ogaden War and all these victories. And then the question is like, okay, how are you going to tell this story for Ethiopian Somalis? Some of them, of course, they were mobilized across the border, but is it because they just preferred or wanted to, or there were circumstances which really made them kind of being, oriented towards more Mogadishu than Addis Ababa by the time. Now the Somali region is really becoming Ethiopia in its own terms, because the terms of citizenship have changed, and our federal project has also delivered to some extent. So then it makes sense to identify now with Addis Ababa than Mogadishu, for instance. The Greater Somalia project is now discredited, yeah? Unless you contextualize alliances, people's political orientation, if you really commemorate a certain victory in a way that it also produces winners and losers, in a way like some bad guys and good guys in town, I don't think this is a good idea. We need to be very careful, and for me, memory is as much remembering as it is forgetting. We have to conveniently and actively forget some of the issues as much as we consciously remember. So memory is about it's politics, yeah. It's about remembering and forgetting, and Ethiopia would be in a better position if it forgets Karamara, or not telling it or pushing it as a grand narrative as it is the case currently, because it creates this permanent enmity between Ethiopia and Somalia. But for me, it's more concerning is to what extent it could alienate Ethiopia's own population, the Somali population, because that discourse, that narrative creates a particular subject which is unreliable, not trustworthy Somali population within Ethiopia. What do we get out of this? Yeah, so that's why what makes a story, a narrative grand is problematic. We need to be very cautious in selecting the stories in a more, conflict-sensitive manner.
Great. I think as Ethiopians, it makes us hopeful to see the new efforts to create, an inclusive grand narratives. So on the other side, like you just mentioned, there needs to be a balance. I believe we need to balance the opportunities, but also the challenges it might bring. Mm-hmm. So on a related note, during transitional periods, it often brings significant turbulence to national security. So we see this challenge in Ethiopia currently. In this sense, are grand narratives important in this context? And also, how might they help mitigate the challenges of national security?
And again, this takes me back to the previous point, grand narratives are not inherently good or bad. So it depends, what specific grand narrative is being pushed, when and why, yeah? For instance, for the new government in Ethiopia in 2018, in order to somehow get that balance between politics of difference or pluralism and also the politics of national unity, and this Ethiopianist rhetoric was important, because that was silenced for long. It's only towards the later part of the previous government that the idea of Ethiopia was released, because it was imperial, it was oppressive, and it was also very disruptive. But then, as the country was shifting from pluralism, from diversity to commonality, and that grand narrative, this Ethiopianist narrative, sometimes it's a little bit an overdose, but that was maybe functional in order to bring in some sense of direction, some sort of convergence, even national consensus. And of course, as I said, narratives could be inherently conflictual, and it depends on how they are pushed and how far and why. Unless you have a clear communication strategy, it could also be threatening of the others. You remember as much, many people were excited by these pan-Ethiopian narratives in 2018 and 19. The flip side to it is it also antagonized other political communities in Ethiopia. So the federalists felt the empire back in, yeah? Along the years we have seen that it wasn't, yeah? now it's kind of a simultaneous engagement with also pluralism, diversity, but also kind of balancing it with kind of things that we share in common. But I'm not so sure whether it was effectively communicated, and some people considered it as just simply populism, and others say like, okay, the empire is back in, hence the grand narratives were not as helpful as they could have been. But gradually, I think maybe any system, any government also needs its own learning curve, I would say. But now it's a bit more nuanced, but still a lot remains to be desired. You know, the way we pick our grand narratives and the way we tell them, and then how we communicate that to the public. Because sometimes they just simply, certain stories pop up and people are wondering, what is this now? Some of them might misunderstand it. They don't know the background. They don't know the project. Grand narratives are part of a greater political project. If the political project is to deal with the excesses of the politics of difference, for instance, because, you know, there are as many, you know, many things that we share in common as there are differences. So it all depends, like, what do you really want? If you want to highlight our differences, plenty of them. But if you really want to also highlight things that we share in common, there are also plenty of them. Of course, the challenge is how to get balance between both our differences and similarities. So the kind of grand stories, you know, the kind of grand story that we craft should also be balanced in a way. They should also be well thought out, not just simply they are grandiose or make Ethiopian exceptionalism. No, rather, you know, for instance, more secular narratives or even sacred narratives, but more balanced. Like, you know, if Ethiopia feels comfortable for Ethiopian Christians with the Solomonic narratives, like we are mentioned, you know, more than 20 times in the Bible, if this makes people feel good about themselves, why not? Be it, yeah? And if the same, you know, Ethiopia with a different angle, and if you see that, oh, Ethiopia is also special for Muslims or in Islamic history. For me, I don't have any problem. It's even good, yeah? Of course, at some point, they could also be conflictual, as it was the case. But then, you know, they could also coexist. But it has to be mediated. And how we bring them into the national space, you know, states should also be very careful not to take side, not to be partisan. You know, just for political expediency, they just simply, you know, fund or promote a certain religious narrative at the expense, then it becomes conflictual. But in a way, they could also coexist and very helpful in nation building, and especially in transitions, as you said, because transition is, you know, like, you know, an old order is unraveling, or it's just gone, or it's no longer legitimate. And then a new order is still in the making. And then in between, you need kind of narratives which build social cohesion. Yeah. Otherwise, you know, even with that, transitions are inherently very challenging and conflictual and problematic. So narratives really play a very important role. So we shouldn't dismiss them as just like, you know, stories as we cherry pick as they fit, but it should be well thought out and as part of a nation building project.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So as the Ethiopian government is restructuring its foreign policy with a focus especially on building positive relationship with its neighbors, as we were discussing, what role do grand narratives play in this process? And also, can you identify the challenges and also opportunities these narratives bring?
I think Ethiopia should play a very important role in creating kind of a regional grand narrative as well. Now at the moment, we are very busy in defining and articulating national interest. That's why I call it this kind of, with a very high dose of realist in our foreign policy, which is part of the disruption, as it is also mentioned by government officials, in order to create a new space for negotiation, because the status quo now is not favorable for Ethiopia. Yeah, I mean, how it's trying to break out of this deadlock or status quo is partly, you know, you need disruption to set an agenda. Otherwise, you will not be taken seriously. Like Ethiopia's maritime interest, for instance, couple of years ago, nobody could really talk about it, but now everybody's talking about it. So in that sense, I can understand disruption is functional in initiating a new regional conversation. Yeah, but then this should not really always be promoted along exclusive lines, like we used to have a port, so we deserve now. We are kind of, or a demographic argument, yeah? We are, the largest landlocked country, so we deserve. At the beginning, perhaps, as I said, for that disruption, but once you get that space, if you continue along that lines, I think it could be conflictual. But rather, as I said, for instance, Ethiopia can champion, kind of complementary regional economies, or that this is a region where, people and people's history goes much deeper and longer than states' history. Yeah, we are not really Eritreans from Mars, Ethiopians from Venus, and then Sudanese from Jupiter. I mean, these are basically very close people. We should also have this kind of people-to-people integration, or integration from below, not just simply formal frameworks, but how many of us really feel comfortable listening to Sudanese music, for instance? Yeah. And you would be surprised if you go to Khartoum and to what extent coffee culture has become, Ethiopian style, distinctly Ethiopian, or their wedding songs, and to what extent they really need Ethiopian cultural component to complete a wedding ceremony, for instance. I mean, these are everyday forms of regional integration, which really are very important and powerful to help us have some tough conversation or hard talks. Before we get there, we need to hug the process to facilitate that, because we can highlight things that we share in common as well. Not just simply national interest, realism, balance of power. It is needed, more so because, as I said, I partly agree that Ethiopia has been, far too long very timid in its diplomacy. The idea of playing our cards well, it makes sense. But then we need to complement that with kind of, new grand regional narrative, not just simply grand national narratives, because ultimately peace and stability in the region can be ensured through a collective security, and that requires reconfiguration of existing regional security architecture, which is based on zero sum. Ethiopia wins if Somalia loses. Somalia wins if Ethiopia. And this is, unfortunately, this is our operational context. And we should contribute. We should take even the lead somehow to change the regional conversation, to reconfigure nationally, not just simply promoting national interest, but interest it depends on how you define it and your positions. But if you change your position, your interest also changes. As we speak, it's unfortunately it's a zero-sum game. Yeah. So going this and that, and then a little bit of blackmailing, a little bit of showing your relevance, and for instance, Somalia's response to the MOU is to activate, going, Cairo and Asmara, and this is symbolic interactionism, telling Addis Ababa, you know what, I have many cards to play, and then in Ethiopia, tit for tat. This is the logic of realist foreign policy. Okay, as you go to Cairo, also we come to your backyard. I mean, this is exactly what happened. This is not collective security. This is, when interests are pushed only along national lines. I think we need to unpack national interest, the limits of national interest, but as we define and articulate national interest, we should go beyond that and start thinking about perhaps contributing for a regional interest as well, which is possible, because we are in a way wired to kind of grow together. And as I said, is it by chance, by default? But as I said, why should Ethiopia have just too many rivers? Why not we redefine what appears a liability into an asset? And the fact that we have something to negotiate with. Yeah, again, our neighbors have very long coastline, and why not we really kind of redefine our national interest in a way that we benefit from each other, yeah? Because unfortunately, not nearly all of our neighbors, except the Sudan, and even that has something to do with the tributary from Ethiopia and other regions, that they are not well endowed with water resources. I mean, let's face it, yeah? And Ethiopia, historical accident or however it has come about, we are landlocked country. And look at our neighbors, yeah? So this could be, I mean, this apparently is conflictual, yeah? But why not we change the optic, yeah? And then as we change the optic, or our interest also changes. So in a way that we can start thinking about how can we grow together by leveraging each other's comparative advantage instead of using this as a reason for conflict.
Great. We were discussing about Ethiopia's historic relations with its neighbors, and my next question relates to this. So currently Ethiopia is creating alliances with Middle Eastern countries, as we know. Historically, the grand narrative of the Christian kingdom, like you just mentioned, the island of Christianity, was surrounded by hostile neighbors led by the state to seek alliances in distant regions, particularly Europe. So what change does this narrative bring, and do you think this has driven a shift in our country?
I think, as the saying has it, charity begins at home. Engagement should start with the region. Of course, far-off places are important. We are part of the international system. But a foreign policy which doesn't focus on its immediate region is not going anywhere, because there's a lot of stake in the region. Yeah, Ethiopia has been kind of more focused on the West historically, and then switched from West to East during the socialist era. That's where our ideology was coming from. And then, you know, this historically sedimented grand narrative of Ethiopia, an island of Christianity, came at a cost. We rarely really considered our neighbors, who happen to be predominantly Muslims, with the exception of perhaps Kenya. Just look around, yeah. And now I think as we change our grand narratives from an island to a sea, or however we term it, it is creating a new field of possibility for geopolitical engagement with the region, particularly with the Gulf countries. We have reached a time when, for instance, our government openly says not only that it's not wrong to say that we should be a member of the Arab League, but we should actively pursue it. This would have been impossible. This would have been a diplomatic and a political suicide for an Ethiopian government. Yeah, because in our national psyche, like, we are not Arab. You know, countries become member of the Arab League not because they are Arabs. Some of them, might go along that line. Eritrea is a member of the Arab League. Yeah, and all our neighbors except Kenya, they are a member of the Arab League. We even never tried to be honorary member or observer because, it sounds a contradiction in terms. Yeah, it's not pragmatic. It's also it's exclusive. We are instead of leveraging what can be really used, we are using that as a threat somehow. Yeah, and if Ethiopia joins the Arab League without being Arab, yeah, can you imagine the affordances of this kind of more pragmatic policy? But of course, this first needed a reworking of our grand narratives. Ethiopia, an island of Christianity, cannot really be a member of the Arab League. I mean, let's face it. But this is a country where, even if we agree with the conservative estimate of our last census, 33% of Ethiopian population are Muslims. This means, in absolute terms, there are more Muslims in Ethiopia than in Iraq. And rarely people see it this way. Yeah? And if the non-Muslim population of Ethiopia wouldn't lose by joining the Arab League, and if Ethiopian Muslims feel, they are also part of another community which they feel belonging, what's wrong with that? And as long as also the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is a member of the Christian, I forgot the exact term, there is also an international framework for all Christians to be a member of, yeah? International Christian, I forgot, World of Council, something like that. It wasn't an issue because we are used to it. But if if we also do it kind of a bit differently, this might have created an uproar. But it's good that we have come a long way in reworking our narratives. At least we are considering that as a possibility. For me, not only pragmatism, but this is also historically plausible.
My final question. In many cases, grand narratives, like you were mentioning, are constructed in a way that creates an us versus them mentality toward our neighboring states particularly. So how can Ethiopia develop a grand narrative that avoids animosity towards our neighboring countries and instead creates a mutual benefit and regional cooperation like you were mentioning?
As I said, more Adwa, less Karamara, or no Karamara, or as we keep Solomon, we don't have to deconstruct tradition. We are not interested in the truth value of them. Yeah, this is, kind of like what the affordances of this narrative, which really interests me, not the truth value. Whether Queen of Sheba exists historically or not, it's not my interest. My interest is that people believe in that, and that this made history, and to what extent this also created a certain belonging among, Ethiopia's population. It's the same with the Najashi narrative. I don't want to indulge in the debate. It's not only that, the Sahabas came to Ethiopia, but ultimately a Christian king became Muslim. That's not where my interest lies. But, to what extent this story, this narrative is so important for Ethiopian Muslims, and then to what extent this can help us also make connections with the Islamic world instead of considering them as a threat. But we are also part of that community, and then we can also tap into that as an important historical repertoire for nation building, but also for regional integration as well. But as I've repeatedly said, grand narratives are, not just simply useful, but they can also be conflictual. So we have to be very cautious in picking our grand narratives. What constitutes a grand narrative? Which story become grand has something to do with the context, with our political. So what do we really want? Yeah, again, this takes me back to the original position. Nations are constructed in different ways. Part of the way of that construction is the story that they tell themselves. So what do we want to be as a nation? If we are clear on that lane, and looking for that stories which are functional for nation building would not be problematic. That's why I found a bit of a contradiction between Adwa and Karamara. Yeah. So the whole idea, if the whole project, the new project, is building Ethiopia on a more inclusive basis to balance difference with unity, I wouldn't go for Karamara. Yeah, you know what I'm saying, and it's because it is very deeply contested. And it's also like, we can understand, like, at some point in time, a part of the population of a country might feel alienated. They don't have a sense of strong belonging. They might, get involved in alternative and cross-border political imaginary. The Somali part of Ethiopia's population during that war, during the Ethio-Somalia war, we can endlessly debate why they sided, some of them at least, sided in favor of Somalia against Ethiopia. They are not being unpatriotic. The idea of Ethiopia was too far for them. There is also a religious component, not just simply ethnical. Yeah? By the way, it's not only the Somalis, but part of the Oromo population in eastern part of Ethiopia were mobilized as part of Greater Somali project. Yeah? The Somali Abo Liberation Front is basically, it's like, the Oromo speaking part of Hararge being part of that Greater Somalia project. What are we now? Are we saying that these are bad guys? They are unpatriotic. But what is that Ethiopia which really, what did it offer them? The very deep sense of alienation. And perhaps maybe because of religious solidarity, or the idea of Greater Somalia might have been, might have appeared better, alternative than Ethiopia. What if, the way they related with Ethiopia, the code is like oppression, domination, double for some ethnically and religiously. Now in 2025, should we really blame them for incomplete nation building process of the 1970s? Yeah? But for me, Adwa is, we have really a very important historical capital that we can wisely spend. But even unfortunately, Adwa was, the terms of the debate were conflictual. We are gradually moving, still work in progress. As we try to improve, we have to make sure that we don't really create new problems, kind of replacing one by the other. I don't think this is the right way of doing it, but I see, if I have to do a balance sheet, we are really making improvement, but we just started that. There's a lot in the Adwa narrative that we can wisely spend domestically, but for the region and continentally as well.
Great, Dr. Dereje. Anything you might want to add?
I think we have exhausted many issues, and I think that's it from my side.
Great, thank you so much. We have had a very timely and important discussion, not just for Ethiopians, but for the whole region, I might say. And thank you so much for coming. On behalf of my viewers, thank you so much, Dereje.
Once again, thank you very much for having me.